One thing before we get into it, can everyone hear me okay? That's working? Fantastic. There was one particular stat in the research that Gay presented earlier, around 19% of budgets, let's call it 20%, I'm in sales, so we round everything up, are new, essentially, appearing out of thin air. I'm sort of keen to understand where they're coming from. Can we point the finger at either of you? I guess the reason I'm asking, for the retailers in the room, they need to know who to take to lunch after this.
Always me. I love a lunch. Most people in the audience who know me know I love a lunch.
Gosh, she's quick.
Oh no, sorry, just me. You can take me and Kelly, actually. I think that there is new budget coming in, for sure. Definitely with some of our brands, we're seeing budget increase. I think a lot of brands in the last few years have done zero-based budgeting, so it's taken them backwards, and so they're starting to see that money come through. I think there's also probably an interpretation piece in it as well, in terms of budget might have moved out of what was brand into trade, or budget that was trade moving into, you know, other ways and ways that it can be used, moving out of promotion allowance into trade allowance, etc. So I think there's probably an interpretation piece in that data point. But yeah, I definitely think there's new budgets coming in for sure.
I wasn't expecting a serious response there, but
sorry.
Appreciate it. Thanks, Leah. But lunches make the world go round, don't they?
I can talk about this all day. Can go from lunch to dinner, so yeah, just let me know.
To sort of take a step back, and I guess for some of the retailers in the room, because I know we've got a few retailers here today who are, you know, absolutely masters of their craft when it comes to the retail world, but maybe, I guess, a little less versed in the media world. To take a step back, before we sort of kick things off, can you explain what is the role of a media agency, and then more specifically to both of your businesses, what does your agency do better than anyone else? I might start with you, Kelly, if that's all right.
Yeah, sure thing. So I'm 4 months into the agency world, having been a client and a media owner for my entire career until this point. So for me, the role of the media agency is this neutral player overseeing the whole landscape and giving a perspective on all of the tools that are at the disposal of that brand. And from a Mars United commerce perspective, I think we're pretty uniquely placed as both a buyer on retail media networks and a builder of retail media networks. And to clarify that second point, because that's quite an unusual statement for an agency to make, we are the agency that built the foundation of Walmart Connect in the US, and we've done that for multiple retail media networks globally. So I think we're uniquely positioned to understand the pressures of that the retailers go through as they launch that, but also from a brand perspective, what they expect from that retail media network when they buy on it. Thanks,
Kelly. Leah.
And you should be more succinct than me. I'm also only 12 months into a journey of working in a media agency. For those that don't know me, I have also spent the last 10 years working supplier-based businesses. I would echo everything that Kelly said. I also think that we are agnostic when it comes to the media publishers that we work with. WPP is obviously one of the largest media holdcos in the world. We are very fortunate to have strong relationships across, you know, the entire media space. And I think when it comes to the role of commerce at WPP, we are helping brands to understand how retailers fit into that space. Equally, we're helping retailers to understand how they fit into that space. And I think, you know, I spend loads of my time on the phone to brands talking through like what best practice looks like, fair media value, all of those kind of things. And equally, I spend just as much time speaking to retailers about what is the industry demanding, what does their product roadmap look like, you know, how can they be better placed to lean into the future of where things are going.
I actually saw a LinkedIn post from you, Leah, about a week or so ago talking about this event and this panel specifically. And one of the things you mentioned was that you'd been agency side for about 12 months. You've worked brand side previously, most recently with Goodman Fielder. And the last 12 months for you, I guess, had really sort of reaffirmed the role of agencies within retail media. Is there anything in particular for you that really reaffirmed things, where you kind of had that penny drop moment?
Yeah, totally. So I know there was a comment made on the previous panel about, you know, brands not looking to hand their spend to agency. For those that don't know, at Goodman Fielder, our agency was planning our trade budget on behalf of our business, on behalf of sales. I think I'm very fortunate to work with some very large CPG brands, some very large D2C businesses, retailers across the world and also in Australia. And we're having similar conversations across the board. What I think is really exciting is that sales and category are often in those conversations. There is someone who represents commercial in those conversations, and it's the collaboration that we see between, media, marketing and sales within those businesses coming into the room to help to navigate, the conversation in the future of where they want to take their business. I think really affirms to me that, agencies do have a role to play in the space. There's not one size fits all. I'm certainly not having a conversation with one brand and then having the same conversation with another brand and just cookie cutter approach. It's very specific to business need and necessity. But I think brands appreciate having stewardship in the space and support, and someone being able to bounce ideas or strategies off, businesses that do these kind of negotiations and have these kind of conversations all the time.
I want to touch on the State of the Nation research, largely because I think off the top of my head about trying to find gay there, but I think about 2/3 of respondents came from media agencies. I imagine that you might have responded to the survey yourselves. And as Gay mentioned when she was presenting the findings earlier, it's not necessarily all sunshine and rainbows and lollipops. There was one particular stat which sort of really leapt out at me, and probably a few others as well, which was that less than half, it was about 44% of respondents rated their experience working with retail media networks as good. And that was down from 66% on the previous survey. So, as I say, considering the majority of respondents work for media agencies, can you share some thoughts on where this sort of drop in positive sentiment might be coming from, Kelly?
Yeah, sure thing. So I think the first thing I'll say is that when something new is being built, is it ever easy or, happy all the time? Absolutely not. And we're building something from the ground up here. Everything that we're doing, we're sort of talking about an industry maturing, etc. But I actually think we are still quite early on in this, and there's a huge amount to be figured out. Obviously, we've talked about measurement extensively today, etc. But I think that's part of what we're seeing in that sentiment is, there's some friction being created because we're building something new. The other thing that might be creating that sentiment is I think there's an opportunity for agencies to be brought to the table more in these conversations with retailers in particular as they're developing those products. I think sometimes, and again, sort of 4 months into being on this side, we are sort of maybe put on the outskirts a little bit, and we sometimes find that clients are getting access to different reporting, different support, different education than we are as agencies. And I think that drives some of that friction and dissatisfaction potentially with that relationship piece that can be improved. And again, I think that's about where retailers are sort of figuring out how they want agencies to play with them. I'm not going to talk about measurement because I think you're probably going to talk about measurement. But those are sort of the two things that I've observed in the first kind of 4 months where I think there's opportunity to grow.
Ms. Jackson, sounds like you might want to build on that one.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting that we talk about the evolution, the growth of investment behind retail media, yet the satisfaction of working with retail media businesses is declining. I think it's probably because agencies are playing a bigger role and operating on behalf of brands, and there is a level of standardisation in reporting and in metrics that we kind of expect to make strategic decisions on behalf of our clients. I think partly the reason why there were so many people from agency who answered the question is because between our businesses and probably OMG, there is an incredible amount of lean-in by agency people into this space. So they're super vested. They want to see change and improvements made. They want to operate, with their clients' best interest at heart. And I definitely think, you're coming from a space, or we're coming from a space of we have expectations of publishers in terms of what they're able to provide back from a measurement perspective, and there's probably, measurement is currency to retailers. Being able to provide that deep level of reporting is currency to retailers, and I think there's this weird, friction point between brands, retailers and agencies in terms of how that kind of passes through. I will just add though, I think, Andy really communicated it well in terms of, we put so much focus on incrementality and ROI and ROAS, blah, blah, blah. I think we're having the wrong conversations when it comes to measurement, and I actually think agencies have a very important role to play to educate brands that retail media does an amazing job from a brand perspective, and we should be looking at measurement from a sales media marketing point of view, not just purely wholly and solely based around transactional information.
And to build on what Leah said there, I think that's why it's really important, the point that we both made at the beginning, that the agency plays that neutral party, the overseer of the entire media plan. So sort of understanding how that data, how that purchasing fits into the messaging that the customer sees across the board. I think that's a really important role and a really important discussion point as we think about how this industry evolves and grows.
Going back to that State of the Nation research, I think off the top of my head, the stat was half of respondents are currently using retail media as a branding tool, essentially. In your respective views, is that number too low?
Oh, I don't know that it's too low. I mean, I think there's an opportunity for non-endemics to be playing more heavily in the space, or near-endemic brands. So if you're, I don't know, Ford, who's a client of ours, there's an opportunity to work with Bunnings, for example, a lot of tradies who drive utes, and you sell a lot of utes, right? So that makes sense. I think that's a great channel to utilise from a brand perspective. I think brands, the other stat that kind of comes to mind of what you're saying, Ben, is brands are leaning in, they're using 3+ retail media networks. I think a lot of that comes from the data that brands are starting to use to inform their strategies. And so when you look at it that way, there is an opportunity to drive brand. If you're using contextual behavioural data to inform your targeting strategy, then naturally you're probably going to show up and be measuring on brand as opposed to conversion.
I think it's very product specific. So I think I definitely expect brand awareness metrics to be looked at with different priority if you were buying a Prime Video ad with Amazon data overlaid to if you were buying a digital out-of-home screen at the front of a store. So I think again, that openness to understanding that not all the metrics are going to apply to everything in the same way. Therefore, we should not be KPIing every piece of retail media in the same way. Therefore, we should not be weighing where our investment goes in the same way. I think that's where you sort of talked about that trifecta of the kind of brand, the agency, and the retailer in the room together, really sort of opening up and digging into that and thinking about, where should something be living? I won't sort of say a funnel, because we know the funnel's not quite a funnel anymore, but, these products have all got different roles to play and different measurement metrics that sit alongside them.
Going off script here slightly.
Or can we?
I did want to flag a conversation that I had with a fairly prominent person within a prominent retailer yesterday, because I think retailers deserve some sort of representation on this panel. We were discussing today's panel, actually, and the view that this person held, they're not in this room, by the way, I don't think they are, was that media agencies get media, absolutely. They don't necessarily get retail. Do you think that's a fair comment? And where do you think that might be coming from? Kelly, I did give you a heads up about this one earlier today.
Why
so
didn't I get a heads up?
I couldn't find you. I was looking for you before you.
Sorry, I know he said it. I've heard it many times.
Right, you probably do. I might throw it to you first then, Kelly, if that's all right, because I guess you've been given somewhat of a heads up.
Yes, yeah, I'm glad I found you. So I think we are unique in that we are the world's oldest retail media agency. So we've never been anything else. Like, we're built around the foundation of being aligned to retailer hubs. So if you see our business in the US, there is a team in Cincinnati for Kroger, a team in Seattle for Amazon, a team in Bentonville for Walmart. And a big part of my role coming into Australia is an ambition to do exactly the same thing with the retailers here. Clearly the geographic spread will be slightly different, but that sort of ambition to have that depth of knowledge I think is really important. I think one of the things we talked about is, agencies can only be as educated as the partners allow them to be. So why do I say that? I think the platforms and media owners that agencies are incredibly proficient in are that way because there's certification, there's education available, there are seminars, there's case study sharing. I think an invite to that table in greater depth in the retail space is definitely an area where there's room for opportunity and growth. And I think to any retailers in the room, your agency community are hungry for that and are very eager to lean in and help, because I think the better educated we are, the better educated and the better strategic decisions your clients will make alongside us, and the more money you will make, which ultimately is what this comes down to. So education, education, education.
I would agree. I mean, we also, represent significant retailers across the world. Amazon is a client of ours. Pretty sure we've seen them as number one on the board, first up this morning. I think that clients or, mutual client suppliers are sharing very readily with agency. I think there are a number of people in our business who could have sat on this stage and talked about the role of agency because they know just as much information as I do in terms of the retail dynamic and the relationship that exists. I think, the conversations that I have, include anything from JBPs to fifth margin to promo strategies to category data and insights. These are the conversations that media people are having. So I think, there is incredible lean in from retailers in this space as well. We work with everybody from, the large grocery retail media networks to emerging retail media networks, and we're seeing that willingness of sharing come through. And I think, media people do understand the dynamic of the retailer relationship. And certainly, the conversation we have with our clients is not around their commercial discussions, their commercial arrangements. That's, I think, I could stomp around in that space. That's my background, but I, don't stomp around in that space because I fully appreciate that there are other complexities to those discussions as there are that exist between media agencies and publishers. But what we do want to do is find a way to collaborate to make sure we're driving the industry forward. We're working together to define how we're going to go and how we're going to match, the expectation to the actual opportunity. There's some big numbers that get thrown around. There's big consulting groups that go into retailers and say you can make, X number of million, like double, triple figures in the next 5-10 years. But then it's like, well, how am I going to do that? And I think, agencies, understand the dynamic with retail and are able to work together in terms of driving and generating demand to meet the expectations.
And I probably should have caveated this conversation by saying, and without sort of blowing too much smoke up either of your backsides,
don't stop. No,
your respective agencies really are sort of leading the charge in this space. You have been quite pioneering in terms of Mars United Commerce, which is not particularly surprising given retail is what you do, but also Group M. There was a WPP, I should say, WPP Media, more specifically these days. There was a comment from, I think it's Raphael, isn't it? Yes, from Google on the measurement panel previously, which I completely agree with, that we don't want to see retail media becoming just another line item on a plan. And as I say, I completely get that. I agree with that. But I guess at the same time, we don't want it to be siloed from the rest of media either. So I guess from a buyer's perspective, how do you ensure that retail media can be bought relatively seamlessly as part of the media mix? And more specifically, is there a role for agencies to play here?
I think we hear, and sorry, you're going to feel like this is the pot shot at you. We hear that you can't have a retail media network without screens. I counter that with
100% true.
You can't have a retail media network without customers, and the data that comes with those customers. And I think to the point that Rog made about data being the ticket to the game, the accessibility of that is really, really critical in terms of the way that agencies and brands can work together to recognise the opportunity. We're very fortunate at WPP Media that we work very closely with InfoSum to the point where Lomas and I were high-fiving each other that we had been working with them well before the acquisition happened, and we were like, oh my God, we're back in a winner. And I think, clean room solutions is a very, very important, it's a very important piece of the puzzle, particularly in this market as we head into, some stringent privacy reform. I think, it gives retailers the opportunity to, utilise brand budgets in a way that is familiar with agencies. For those that are in the room that may be thinking about starting a retail media network, I totally agree the capital expenditure to set one of those up is astronomical. So, if you can find a way to make your data accessible, you can literally turn on your spend tomorrow. Like it's a no-brainer. And so I think, that's probably for us is, probably a pretty critical piece.
So I think my favourite phrase that I read from Cannes in amongst all of the AI bingo sort of wording was as a client, your org structure should not appear in your media plan. And I think with media, retail media, and we use the word silo a ton, I think actually when we sort of look at org structures, it's starting to really filter through very well into how the client then sees that media represented in front of them. And I think your sort of question about, where does the media agency play, like how should retail media fit? I think there's this enormous opportunity to bring this channel, platform, whatever we want to call each piece of it, into the centre of that client strategic planning process by starting with the question of, what do we want the customer to do differently? And which of these touch points are we going to bring in to make them go and buy our product when they walk into Woolworths, Coles, other than instead of a competitor's. So I think that's the place that I'd like to start seeing us start from and think about retail media's function within that part of the problem solving. Because again, we spend a lot of time talking about where this lives, but maybe not enough time talking about how we service the customer, utilising this fabulous new tool that is growing that we've got access to. And obviously within the research, above the line got talked about how does this start to influence that. I think the opportunity to start to connect, at minimum, the creative messaging through all of these touch points for the customer, but obviously at maximum, ambitiously, the customer insights that are gained throughout. Like how do we bring that customer insight around sort of which cheese a customer's purchased in the supermarket all the way through to their TV, out of home, etc. So I think that for me is sort of where I'm excited about where this is going, but again, a challenging problem to solve.
We'll just say, even, I'm just listening to Kel speak, and even, we drop SSP, DSP, clean room. These are super complex terms. I come from a marketing background, 30-something people in the marketing team at Goodman Fielder, and I reckon a solid 70% of the team don't understand what all of that terminology means. I think even that alone is part of the reason why agencies have such a strong role to play in this space. It's becoming incredibly complex and sophisticated. There's an education piece, we share very broadly, share across the teams with the clients, etc. But, there's also areas of expertise that things that people are really, really, really good at. And I think, in a way, the sales and commercial teams that I engage with are like, oh my God, please take it off my hands. I don't get it anymore. I can do an end cap, I can do an off location, I can negotiate my promo strategy, but what the frig is off network? What does that mean? I think, we have such an important role to play in terms of, really supporting our client businesses.
I've got to say I've been sort of pleasantly surprised by the lack of buzzwords that have featured throughout, not just this panel, but the other sessions today as well. On that note, that sort of might be a nice sort of segue to the final question. And you touched on some of these things in your previous answer, Kelly, but I'm sort of keen to understand what the future looks like in terms of do you see the role of retail media evolving over the next, let's say, 5 years or so? And if so, what does that look like?
Yes, I see it evolving because I think we're at the beginning. I see it evolving in terms of what the touch points look like in store and outside of store, sort of how the retailer kind of thinks about that. I see it evolving in terms of how it gets pulled into the wider media planning. And the area that we haven't talked about much at all today is I see it evolving in terms of how creatively it comes to life, because I think that's the last piece of the puzzle actually that none of us at the moment are spending enough time on, is how do we make this super appealing for the customer to see and interact with. So I guess, yes, evolution is going to happen. I'm excited about all of it. Don't know where it's going, and that's part of the reason that I love being a part of the journey.
And just quickly on that before I get your response, Leah, that role that agencies are playing that you've sort of outlined today, do you see that changing as well?
Yes, I mean, I'm optimistic that my sort of cry for education and sort of getting a full seat at the table will be heard. And I think, I would hope in 5 years' time, my goodness, that we are having, very much a three-way dialogue where it's, a conversation about how can we do the best thing to get our communication message across to the customer in the best possible way, using all of the touch points. And not thinking about it in that horrible word silo, which seems to appear in every article that gets written about this part of the industry. So yes, I guess if I was to summarise that, in 5 years' time, hopefully all the silos will be gone.
Any final thoughts from you, Leah, on the future?
I mean, I'm going to tweak the question slightly. What would I like to see evolve? I think moving away from silo is key. I think collaboration is critical. There are some incredibly smart people who work in agency. Cam Porter, who works on her team, Nat Hatch, who's at IPG, who literally taught me anything I know about data. Like, these are people who I respect. We talk all the time. We collaborate. We don't share confidential information about our clients, but we collaborate. And I think there is an opportunity for retailers to also collaborate, and in terms of, you know, where can we see some standardization. You're going to put your magic sauce on top, and there's always going to be the nuance, but I think, you know, just creating a level playing field is really important, not just for big brands, but also for those, you know, mid-tier and smaller brands. I think that from a technology perspective, we need to absolutely be working towards, you know, a very egalitarian place to play and away from a walled garden mentality. Certainly, you know, some of the big pure play e-com businesses that we work with are looking at that too. They're huge at what they do. They're 5-star when you look at digital retail media networks, but they're also facing into their own challenges, particularly in this market where, you know, 80% of spend still is pretty much wrapped up in in-store media and offline media. And so they're looking at what they can do to kind of, you know, lean in there. Everything comes with its own set of challenges and opportunities. So I think collaboration is going to be really critical in terms of unlocking where we head.
Thank you both for your time and insights. Everyone, please thank Kelly and Leah.